Welcome everyone, including everyone who's going to be watching this on our YouTube channel later. So, thank you, Jan, so much for agreeing to do a talk for us. And we're looking forward to this very much. And I'll hand straight over to you.
Fine. Thank you very much, Tricia, and greetings from Guildford Travel Club. Well, I travelled to Palestine in 2017 with the Palestine Exploration Fund, and it's the oldest organisation in the world which was created specifically for the study of the Levant, part of which was Palestine. It's a beautiful land full of deserts, ancient cities, and also communities that we hear very little of in the West. But Palestine today is a state whose people live under occupation, and it's been scarred and divided by ongoing conflict since the mid-20th century. Now, I travelled to Palestine, as I say, and obviously, inevitably, one sees what's happening in the West Bank. It's never easy to talk about that, but I'd really like to put this into the context of my travels to places like Prague and Krakow, and particularly the Baltic states, where one comes face to face with the unimaginable suffering during World War II, I should say, of the Jewish people. But one can't ignore more recent history, and you inevitably see the outcome of the tragic situation between Israel and Palestine when journeying through this part of the Middle East, where wars, governments, and extremists on both sides have divided communities of Jews and Arabs who used to live together in peace. So my journey is about what I saw when I was travelling through Palestine, and although it may in part evoke sympathy for the Palestinian people, there needs, of course, to be a balanced perspective to understand much more deeply what's been described as the world's most intractable conflict, and why this area of land is so important. But that's not the focus of this travel talk. So Palestine is a land of limestone hills. They give way to the vast Judean desert full of breathtaking views. And the rugged landscape is crossed by deep canyons and ravines, which have provided a refuge for monks and hermits who still inhabit monasteries, which are built in these remote and dramatic locations. And straggling along the escarpments, Palestinian villages now alternate with Israeli settlements. So it's a land where one just can't avoid the political turmoil which has scarred its people for generations. And also, of course, where the world's great religions exist side by side, albeit in seemingly never-ending disharmony. Now, in broad terms, Palestine is a state. It's not a country, of course, recognized by the UN, and it's comparatively little visited by Western tourists, although tourism before COVID struck was increasing year on year. So in the past, very few tours from the UK have travelled through this ancient yet beautiful land. But in our first hotel, there were church tours from as far afield as India and Brazil who'd come to explore its holy sites. Without a doubt, Palestinian territory, as we all know, is shrinking. And the green line, which is shown here, I don't know if you can see my red pointer here, around the West Bank area, was the boundary which was set out following the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. And Israel then controlled 78% of the territory of Palestine. And you can see a lot of black triangles, I hope, which are dotted throughout this area. And they denote the settlements which the Israelis have since built, and the numbers continue to grow. And this slide really illustrates the loss of land which Palestine has suffered progressively since the 1948 war. And just look at the south area of Palestine. On the left, completely green, owned by the Palestinian Authority, and then on the right, just a few dots of small patches in what's known as the West Bank. And even on the land that Palestine still controls, there are still settlements, of course, which are themselves increasing. And the settlements look like this. I'm sorry these two photos aren't that sharp. They were taken from the coach. But there are about 131 settlements in the West Bank and 12 in East Jerusalem. We flew into Tel Aviv and drove northwards towards our first hotel in Bethlehem. And as we approached the city, we came to this sign, which says no passage for Israeli citizens. I traveled with the CEO, as I said, of the Palestine Exploration Fund, and we had a Palestinian guide, Hisham, so there was no problem for us driving into Bethlehem. But almost immediately, the wall came into view with its menacing watchtowers, which are a familiar sight throughout Palestine. The impact of the separation wall is something that you just can't forget, you just can't ignore when you're in Palestine. And Israel began building it in June 2002. They consider it a security barrier for their citizens against terrorism, whereas the Palestinians see it as racial segregation or an apartheid wall. Because in reality, it's cut off Palestinians from their farmland, their schools, and it's destroyed many homes and villages. It's completely plain and white on the Israeli side, but it's covered in graffiti, as you can see on the Palestinian side, and many heart-rending posters. And when it's completed, it's going to be 450 miles long and will completely encircle the West Bank. Now, these are two of the posters, and I just want to mention the one on the left, which tells of a young man from Bethlehem who was refused a permit to visit his girlfriend, who was very ill in Jerusalem. And sadly, she later died. And she put it in her will that she wanted him to carry her coffin. However, this was denied. And so the young man tried to go to Jerusalem without a permit. But he was caught, he was badly beaten and put into prison for 30 days. And this led to a nervous breakdown. Well, you may have seen this image on your TV screens. It's just over 3 years ago in December 2017, and it's since been defaced. 6 weeks to the day following my return from Jerusalem, the peace, which really was very much a fragile peace, was shattered by Donald Trump's recognition that Jerusalem is the capital city of Israel. And of course, the US embassy has since been relocated from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. But for the present, he's history, and we await seeing how the new president will approach the somewhat failed peace process. Well, Palestine itself is a land of contrast. On the left here, a photo of our first hotel in Bethlehem. This was the Jasir Palace. It's the only 5-star hotel in the area, and it has a wonderful Islamic style courtyard as you enter in, a beautiful atrium fringed with palm trees. But if you go deeper into the hotel, the paint in rooms is peeling, carpets are worn, the wiring in bedrooms is really dangerous. I don't think they've heard of health and safety, and the breakfast was actually the worst I've ever experienced on my travels. This map shows the major sites which we visited, and traveling between the towns and villages can be quite complex because you pass in and out of different zones, some under Palestinian control, but others administered by Israel and some jointly. So we begin at Bethlehem, a town which carries so many layers of meaning, some ancient, some religious, and some political. And this is the landscape around Bethlehem, lying above the terraced Judean hills. But This little town of Bethlehem, as the carol says, no longer lies still as the silent stars go by. It's a bustling city in the West Bank with a population now of about 60,000 people. And in fact, it almost merges with Jerusalem, which is about 5.5 miles away. This just gives a feel for the old market, which was noisy and colourful. It's still home to a significant Palestinian Christian community, but it has a Muslim majority now, and women and men with their heads covered, but hints of Western dress which are creeping in on the right-hand photo. Bethlehem, though, of course, is much revered by pilgrims who congregate in Major Square each Christmas and visit the Church of Nativity. And this was, in fact, sadly going through a major restoration project of 5 years or more when I visited. And although the exterior here was virtually finished, inside was enshrouded completely with white sheets, which covered all the walls and obscured the wonderful mosaics. Except just for the main altar in the basilica. It's very ornate here with silver icons, and I had to actually cut out the scaffolding, which was still there on either side. And just to mention, last Christmas, of course, with COVID, that it was the first year when pilgrims just weren't able to travel to Bethlehem for the Christmas celebrations. Normally thousands descend upon the town. But of course, restaurants and hotels and souvenir shops were closed, and the renowned Christmas lighting of the tree celebrations were limited to just a small group of authorized people. So things have changed in Bethlehem. The main hotel there has had to close permanently. So who knows what's going to happen in the future. But onto a viewpoint which looks towards Bethlehem and Jerusalem. This is the cone-shaped hill of Herodium. It's the highest point in the Judean desert, and it was built by Herod the Great. And shortly before he died, he built his tomb here, together with this massive artificial mountain, which can be seen for miles around. And at Herodium, we're on the edge of the desert. And within half an hour or so from Bethlehem, the landscape changes completely. The temperature rises and it feels as if you're in a different world. And as we drive further into the desert, the light changes, and you can probably see in the center of the photo just two towers here, which emerge in the middle distance. And this is the monastery of Mar Saba. And as you get closer, you see the type of location where monasteries were built, almost hidden below ground level, tucked in at the bottom of the canyon. And Mar Saba itself is an Eastern Orthodox Christian monastery, I should say, overlooking the Qumran Valley. It's halfway between the old city of Jerusalem and the Dead Sea. It's one of the oldest inhabited monasteries in the world. It was founded in 483, and it now still has just about 20 monks. And if you look carefully, there are actually windows and doors along the strata of the cliff here. And these are probably the homes of hermits. And I've blown this slide up and I've looked very carefully, and I can't see any way to access these buildings. They seem to be permanently sort of closed from the inside. It reminds me really of Meteora. I don't know whether anyone's traveled to Meteora in Greece, where there are many monasteries on rocky pinnacles, and there the monks had to have their food and water and everything that they needed hauled up in baskets. In fact, they were themselves taken up to the top of the monastery in baskets. Of course, now steps have been built, but I wonder how these hermits and monks here actually managed to get their food. There are many questions in Palestine which just don't seem to have answers, however deeply you try and research them. But Mar Saba itself still maintains many of its ancient traditions, and one is the restriction on women from entering the monastery. They may only view it from climbing the women's tower. Everything was closed when we were there. So I had to rely on the internet for this photo. This is what it would look like, the cluster of buildings almost growing out of the steep cliff. Just under 20 miles south of Jerusalem, more watchtowers herald the approach of a very important town, Hebron. Hebron can be a volatile city, and we were warned that our visit could be cancelled at short notice, but fortunately all was peaceful. And Hebron is one of the oldest continually inhabited towns in the world. It's sacred to Muslims, Christians, and Jews as the burial place of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their wives. And during the Roman period, Herod built a massive wall to enclose the cave of the prophets' tombs. And these stones are the foundation of the Ibrahimi Mosque here. It's the second holiest site for Jews after the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And today, the building is split between a mosque and a synagogue. Closer in, a view on the left of the tower and then the entrance to the mosque. Now, Hebron has a population of 250,000 Palestinian Arabs, and there have always been a small number of Jews in the city, but in recent years, hundreds of Israeli Jews, many from the United States, have moved in, and they've created a settlement of about 700 or so. And when they moved in, an entire brigade of Israeli soldiers moved in with them as protection. And they set up all the checkpoints that we see today in the city, cordoning off whole sections of Hebron. And inevitably, this has led to problems given the tensions and incidents which occur almost daily. To enter the mosque and the holy sites, then security was among the tightest which we'd seen in Palestine so far, not just one checkpoint, but soldiers at several points in the city. And until 1997, Israel controlled the whole of Hebron, but in 1997 it was divided, and you can see the two areas here, H1, the orange sector, which is the Palestinian area, and then H2, where the Jewish settlers live. But the mosque is actually in the Jewish sector. So when we entered the Jewish area, Hisham, our guide, being Palestinian, wasn't allowed to go with us. Well, as you go into the mosque, it's very spacious, it's beautifully tiled. It has these cenotaphs here, which represent the tombs of the patriarchs. But to visit the ancient synagogue next door, where I photographed these Orthodox Jews, bulletproof walls divide the areas where Muslims and Jews can pray. And there is an ancient door which is locked with chains and huge bolts, and it's guarded by an armed soldier who has a Kalashnikov stretched right across his chest. So you have to leave the mosque and the Palestinian zone, go down a lot of steps, cross a part of the city into the Israeli zone, more steps, more checkpoints, and then re-enter the building, and you can look around the synagogue area there. Well, in the mosque itself, there are actually caves underneath, which are not accessible out of respect for the dead. And there are only 2 entrances which are known to exist. Now, here on the right, underneath this dome, there is a narrow shaft covered by this decorative grate here. And if you kneel down and you look down through this hole just above the carpet, you'll actually see, and it looks a very long way down, a candle flame which is flickering in the cave beneath. And this is said to be the actual burial place of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their wives. So further security checks after we left the mosque, and you actually see and feel a degree of tension in Hebron, which is said to be one of the most divided cities in the world. And just a few days before our visit, 40,000 Israeli settlers had stormed into the mosque during a Jewish holiday. So Israeli occupying forces imposed a curfew on the Palestinian residents here. They closed off numerous roads leading to the mosque, and this was in order to allow the settlers to enter freely. While we were in Hebron, we went into the souk and we met Lila here. And the women in Hebron Cooperative, of which she's a member, make beautiful embroidered items, including the black and white kaffir scarves. You often see Simon Reeves wearing one of these. And these are sold locally. And now you can actually obtain them on the internet. And the proceeds provide the cooperative members and their families with an income in a place where women especially have great difficulty finding employment. But their work here is more than just about generating income. It's about strengthening community in the face of the occupation of Palestine. While we were chatting to Lila, across the narrow passage in the ancient souk was a shop selling rugs and all sorts of other things. And the owner came out with a tray of tea for our entire group of about no more than 16. A real spirit of generosity in Palestine, and we saw this time and time again. We were given presents of boxes of soap, we were given tea and cakes. They wouldn't take any money. But when you have the opportunity in these shops to actually purchase small things like jewelry, they're very appreciative because they're so poor. And sadly, a number of the shops, well, many of the shops, in fact, have closed, shut by Israeli military order in order to protect the settlers who've occupied parts of the city, or because the settler threat makes business unviable. A horrible photo, I would agree. But tragically, I just wanted to show you the other aspect of the souk here. The wire mesh above has been placed there to stop the rubbish, which is thrown down by settlers in the apartments above. You can see the windows there. Another example of extreme tension and hatred. And in places, the wire is actually covered in debris. But I'll leave it to your imagination as to what else might be tipped onto the streets below. In contrast, looking gloriously peaceful in the morning sunshine, Jerusalem has long been the hub of division and conflict. Not so on this beautiful morning. We entered through the Jaffa Gate, and the first sight that you see if you decide to climb the ramparts is the citadel or the Tower of David with its Ottoman minaret. And there are 2 opportunities to walk around the ramparts here. We were planning to go around the sector here, the Christian quarter, to look down at some of the churches, but at very, very short notice, Hisham said that the security guards had closed this off because there was some sort of alert. Apparently this often happens. So we walked around the Armenian quarter and the Jewish quarter. And this was actually quite interesting because it meant that we were walking towards Temple Mount. The Armenian Quarter from above doesn't look very enticing at all, but if you walk through its streets, you come across this gem really, which is an old Syrian Orthodox chapel dating back from the 12th century. And it's said to be on the site of the house, I should say, where members of the early church met. Up on the walls then, walking along the ramparts, you see glimpses of churches and beyond the sprawling city. Sadly, the only issue that morning was that we were now walking into the sun, hence the shadows really on a number of the outlying buildings here. So in the distance, the Jewish cemetery, and the foreground shows a settlement which has sprung up, filling every possible piece of ground available. But the best views, of course, are as you near Temple Mount, looking towards the Mount of Olives, and especially the golden domes of the Russian Orthodox Cathedral. Behind the fortifications, you can probably just see the dome here of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which we'll look at later, and nearby is the Dome of the Rock, arguably perhaps the most impressive and sacred site in Jerusalem, and of huge significance both politically and spiritually to Jews and Muslims alike. The Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox Jews, are a familiar sight as you stroll through the Jewish quarter. And just a point of history is that almost all Haredim were murdered during the Holocaust. But in 1948, when the State of Israel was created, the government offered them protection, somewhere where they could rebuild their world of religious study. And they receive state benefits to enable men to do this, whilst women are expected to marry and to have probably large families. And we'll encounter the Haredim just a little later, but their lobbying power has actually created tension in Israel. The Jewish quarter is full of alleyways, and the entrance on the left here to the cotton market with the its 14th century vaulted 14th century shopping arcade, I should say. I'm just aware of the clock on my screen, and so I'll speed up to try and finish Jerusalem before we have a break. Walking through the city, you come to the Austrian Hospice, and this was the first National Pilgrims guest house in the Holy Land. Its roof provides wonderful views looking out over Old Jerusalem, and on the skyline here, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is in the Christian quarter of the old city, one of Jerusalem's main landmarks, and according to tradition, it's the site of the crucifixion, burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. But a very quick story about this is that the church today is shared by 5 different Christian communities. They're all very territorial, and a small section of the roof is disputed between the Copts and the Ethiopians. And on a very hot summer day in 2002, the Coptic monk was on duty overseeing his area, and he moved his chair just 8 inches into the shade. And this was seen as a hostile act, and 11 people were hospitalized after the fight which ensued. This ladder here, which I don't expect you've noticed, is a symbol of the territorial attitude, and it was placed on the ledge in the 1700s, and no one has dared to move it since. Inside, a quiet spot to reflect and just soak up the atmosphere of a place where pilgrims have journeyed to since the 4th century, the holiest Christian shrine in the old city. And as you leave, you pass by these beautiful lamps, each donated by one of the denominations. The church, 2 more slides before the break. The Church of St. Anne is a wonderfully preserved Crusader church in Jerusalem at Bethesda, near the northern end of Temple Mount. It's believed to be the birthplace of the Virgin Mary, but it's still a peaceful and beautiful space in the middle of the bustling streets and alleys. So we've seen just a glimpse of Jerusalem, and we'll return to the site which draws just so many pilgrims and travellers to the city at the end. But what I particularly enjoyed about Palestine was the desert, and we'll have a look at that after the break.
Thank you very, very much, Jan. It was really, really interesting, fabulous photos. And it's, yeah, I'm sure everyone has really found this really interesting. We have got 5 minutes. If anyone would like to ask a question or make a comment, my brother-in-law, Colin Lovell, is here, which I'm really pleased about. And he just made a comment that when he visited Palestine, at Hebron, they had a lovely meal with the Palestinian family. So that's evoked memories for Colin. So I hope maybe it has for other people. Would anyone like to ask a question or share something? No? Okay, well, okay, we're all pondering, I'm sure. So,
can I ask what time of year she went to Palestine?
What time of year? That was in the autumn, in October, as I recall.
Right.
Yes, because there were no spring flowers. I'm just trying to remember, thinking about other presentations I've been putting together. Yes, of course it was October time, but it was still desperately hot, as you'll see when we reach the desert.
Which year?
What year? 2017.
Right, thank you. I missed that bit.
And Smita has commented. Smita has obviously visited, and Smita has said, I've lost my chat. The Holocaust Memorial, I remember well, and the Lord Jesus' birthplace in Bethlehem with my dad. So Smita, that's great that you two, you've been here and it's bringing back memories for you.
Yes, as I said at the beginning, it's a place that leaves a tremendous impression, and you can't but get emotionally involved, especially when you meet some of the local people. You know, if we have the opportunity to visit again in the future when things calm down, it really is such an interesting place, and I would love to go back. And one thing that people ask me is, did I feel safe there? And I was talking to a friend on the tour, and we both agreed we'd be very happy to go out there and be in Jerusalem on our own. It felt absolutely fine, but you never know when something's going to erupt. But we don't hear much about Palestine or Israel, perhaps a little more about Israel, but very little about Palestine in the news these days. And perhaps things will change now Joe Biden's with us, as he gets into his job, and you know, let's hope that the peace process is reinstated.
Yeah.
How many of your group can you see the group, so you can see a show of hands, so we can see how many people have visited Palestine?
Not everyone has their video on, so
right. I see.
I don't know whether, yeah, because we've now got yeah, we still got 3 minutes, Jan.
Oh, right.
Jan. So I don't know whether you'd like to come out of your screen sharing.
Yes.
And then you can have a quick see of everybody.
Hello, everyone. Oh, it's nice to see you. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
yes, so when you, on the people that you were with, Jan, was it a kind of nationally organized tour, or was it people that you knew, or?
It was done through Martin Randall Travel. It's well-known name in the cultural travel business, and there were people who'd come from America, from Canada, from Australia. It's quite amazing how people fly over to London to actually do these tours. I think they're much cheaper than they'd have to pay in the States. but it's got such a wonderful name, Martin Randall, and they get some of the best lecturers in the business. So that's how that worked, really. But it's the other thing about it is that you know, it's a relatively small group. I would never go on a trip with much more than 20. And so you have lots of space. You have a double seat to yourself on the coach, spread out your camera and your maps and this sort of thing. So
yeah, that's
I'm sure
good
you must have. Sorry.
I was just going to say that's a good recommendation.
Yes,
then, but
yes, absolutely, yeah. Yes. But I'm sure you must have many well-travelled members in Travel Talks Leicester. And it's always good, I think, we do it at Guildford to share with another about our travels. We used to have years ago a notice board where people could put up information, but I think that hasn't happened for a while. But yeah.
Right. Anyway, I think we're probably about to be zoomed out. So
okay.
Thank you again, Jan. Thank you so much.
So olive and palm trees and the occasional rustic Bedouin camp dot the landscape of the area around Jericho. It's reputed to be the oldest inhabited city in the world and said to date back about 11,000 years, over twice as old as the pyramids. Every Palestinian village has at least one mosque with its tall minaret pointing towards the heavens. And the name Jericho means city of palms. In the valley below, beyond the lush palm trees, are everywhere. Sorry, I was expecting another slide to come, but it's thrown me a bit. I should say I was up on a ledge here, and in the valley I was looking down to the lush palm trees in the valley, which are everywhere, and these give the countryside a beautiful green hue. And on the left of the picture here, you may see some buildings, a small cluster of buildings just here on the face of the cliff. And these are somewhat camouflaged, and in the center, perhaps something one doesn't expect to see in the middle of the desert. And you can see it's very small on my screen, two red areas here. And this is a cable car. And the only way to approach those buildings on the cliff face and to see the adjacent caves is via the cable car. This is the, when you get there, this is the Greek Orthodox monastery on the Mount of Temptation. It's the mountain in the Judean desert where Jesus was tempted by the devil. And it's accessed by a path which is incredibly steep and challenging in the hot desert sun. The cable car takes you to an area where you can get a drink, a cup of coffee, and then you walk along a parallel path along the edge of this ridge here. There was a Byzantine monastery here in the 6th century, but the modern monastery was built about 1895, and a handful of monks still live here. A close-up of the modern reinforcements, and the path to approach it was really quite challenging for some of the group. It was about 35 degrees. Unlike some Greek monasteries, the one that we saw earlier, Mar Saba, it allows women visitors. But one of these questions comes to mind here. How did they carry the stone up? This is a little bit further up from the monastery than those hermits in Mar Saba. How on earth did they carry the stone up here to build it, especially the original monastery? We don't know. The next day, the sand appeared whiter in the morning light as we approach the Dead Sea. And down in the valley, you can see on the left of the inset picture, an example of the type of shacks where some of the local Palestinians would live. The outlying villages are peaceful, really beautiful, just nestling beneath the barren hills of this area. It's an incredibly beautiful landscape. And driving in the vicinity of Jericho, the desert looks like this. There's just nothing, no buildings, a white stony wilderness. And the landscape changes again as we approach the Dead Sea. Now, the Dead Sea is dying by about 1 metre a year, probably more. But the Dead Sea water level has dropped by 40 metres since the 1950s. And this has been blamed on the companies manufacturing fertiliser from siphoning so much of the water. And there have been calls for both Israel and Jordan, just across the border, the other side of the Dead Sea, to take action. But the signs at present aren't encouraging. And here we see some measurements on the cliff face on the left at the top and a little bit further down of the water level in past years. I photographed these marks, which were actually taken by people from the Palestinian Exploration Fund. And the Dead Sea is about 400 meters below sea level, and it traps water from the Jordan River. But rainfall in the region has fallen 10% since 1950. And in 2017, it was in the grip of its worst drought for 900 years. So you could see that as I was standing on the road, that is where the water level used to be, a phenomenal drop. The result is that on both the Jordanian and Israeli coast, the shorelines pockmarked by sinkholes, a sign of environmental catastrophe, and more than 1,000 of these have appeared in the last 15 years. They've swallowed a portion of the road, date palm fields, and several buildings on the northwest coast. Now, historically, this is an amazingly rich region with some wonderful sites, and I just want to show you some of these quite quickly. The monastery of St. George is one of the most striking sites of the Holy Land. It's a cliff-hanging complex carved into the sheer rock wall in a deep and narrow gorge in the Judean desert. It was founded in the 5th century, and it's been home again to monks and hermits for many centuries. And it was chosen apparently because it was next to the cave where Elijah is said to have been fed by ravens during the 9th century BC. It stands on the Roman road between Jerusalem and Jericho, where the parable of the Good Samaritan was set. And just remember that word Samaritan, because we'll come back to that in just a little while. Not far to the north, we come to Hisham's palace, the most archaeologically important Islamic monument in Palestine. Really lovely carving, well worth visiting. And as you enter the site, you see this wonderful 6-pointed star, and this symbol now represents the Jericho municipality. And if you like archaeology, there are some wonderful examples of carving here of parts of the palace which have survived. But I want to move on to one of my favourite sites, Qumran, home of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And these were hidden in an almost inaccessible cave. In early 1947, a Bedouin boy discovered a cave after searching for his lost goat. And the cave here held scrolls hidden in jars from 2,000 years ago, and they were preserved so amazingly as a result of the area's arid climate. Qumran is well known also for the Essenes, a community of sectarian Jews who lived and studied here, and scrolls are their legacy. And they included books of the Old Testament, the Apocrypha, and also writings of the Essenes themselves. And the caves and crevices of the rough and steep terrain had proved ideal hiding places for their library. So this is the site of Qumran, right on the shores of the Dead Sea here. It's a very challenging rocky landscape, dotted with caves. And right in the center here is the cave where the scrolls were found. And when you're there, you can just see in the bottom left-hand corner here some rope. I was standing up on a ledge here, and it's very, very steep. Perspective's difficult to show in photography, I think. But when you're here, you can really see just how inaccessible it is, how high it would be, and how difficult to imagine how the Bedouin shepherds climbed up to the cave. Another mystery. One more site in this area, though, before we head down to the Jordan River, and this is Nabi Musa. Nabi Musa is a holy site for Muslims because it's believed to be the tomb of Moses, one of the great prophets also of Islam. A lovely spot here, but again, you can probably see some cables across. It was being renovated when we visited. The camels managed to find a shady spot looking out towards the barren wilderness, and I thought I must show at least one camel, although I know there were two at the beginning. But I went to Jordan I have to work this out because of COVID, 2019, and you see camels just wild across the desert there. It's very different from Palestine. But all around, the mosque is a Muslim graveyard stretching right into the desert hills beyond towards Mount Nebo. And this is the place where Moses was given a view of the Promised Land. And I knew when I was in Palestine that I was going to be visiting Jordan and I was going to go to Mount Nebo. And I was quite looking forward to this because you are supposed to be able to look back and see some of the hills of Jerusalem and a number of the silhouette of some of the cities. Well, yes, I went to Jordan, and yes, I went to the top of Mount Nebo, but sadly it was foggy. And so I have some lovely slides of the road going into the hills, but then the horizon is lost. There we are, that's travel. Down onto along to the Jordan River, Qasr el Yahud is a baptismal site here in the West Bank. And it's a site where, again, according to tradition, Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. And this river here divides Israel and Jordan, and it's very narrow, and it looks as if you could almost swim across, but it's forbidden to cross into Jordan here. Security is very tight. We had to go through sort of airport security just to get down here. But being baptized in the river is not forbidden. And we stood and watched as groups from different nationalities all around the world gathered at this sacred spot. Now, the site here reopened in 2011 after being closed since the Six-Day War in 1967. And this quotation at the bottom from the Times of Israel says that the site is being cleared of landmines. This is to allow pilgrims to visit areas which have been blocked off by these barbed wire fences and to prevent them from walking too close to the landmines. But there's a lot of building work going on here, and they're actually building a new Greek Orthodox church when we were there. Driving north again from the Jordan River towards Nablus, which we'll come to, we turned off the road and we drove for a few minutes into the desert. And we saw these signs of a small settlement as we wound our way into the desert hills once again. And this cluster of shacks here is our introduction to the Bedouins. Palestinian Bedouins are traditionally nomadic and semi-nomadic herders, and they were forced from their lands in the Negev in 48 and resettled in villages in the West Bank. But a small number still live in shacks like this and tents, which also provide shelter for their sheep and goats. I wonder if you can see something that you might notice from the 21st century in this slide. Of course, it's the solar panel here and the satellite dish. So they do have modern means of communication. But inside it looked like this, and we were expected for lunch. And lunch was served from being cooked underground in a pit where a fire was built with burning coals until the red embers glowed. It was in there for several hours, I think. And then this pot of delicious chicken and vegetables and spices was covered and slow roasted. It's called a zarb, or an earth oven, and the meal was absolutely superb with tasty salads and hummus, and of course wine. And Paul, I've heard this before, but once you have tasted the ubiquitous Palestinian hummus, which is served with every meal, you will never want to have Waitrose hummus again, but needs must. As we drove across the desert, there was time to reflect on the lifestyle of the warm and hospitable Bedouin people who we met. And we learned that a number of Palestinians actually choose to apply for a work permit to work in the Israeli settlements, because they would earn substantially more than working in a Palestinian-owned business in the West Bank, where, as I said earlier, unemployment's high, salaries are low, and many even seek work on the separation wall, a structure that they view as harmful. So life is very, very, very hard for the Palestinians as they seek to support their families. Poverty is widespread, is severe in Palestine. Nearly 17% of Palestinians live below the poverty line, which means they're unable to acquire easily the basic necessities of food, clothing, and shelter. And there's an even darker story about these Bedouin people. Many of them, as I said, were resettled in villages in the West Bank. But a number of these are deemed illegal because they don't have the necessary building permits, which means that the homes of the Bedouin who have moved into these villages are therefore under danger of demolition, and they're also, again, denied basic rights such as water and electricity. So the individual stories are very, very tragic. Well, Mount Gerizim here is said to be a holy hill. It's located on the south side of Shechem, today's Arabic city of Nablus. And the mountain is sacred to the Samaritans, who regard it, rather than a Temple Mount in Jerusalem, as having been the location chosen by God for a holy temple. And they are the world's smallest religious community. They're a sect of just a few hundred people linked together by a deep and strict religious faith. And they live in this small mountaintop village near to this stony archaeological site. They welcome visitors, and they're open to talking to visitors about their life. We met with Hosni Cohen here, one of the priests and elders, and he's standing against one of the images within the museum that they have. And we learned that this ancient community dates back to the early tribes of Israel. They practice a religion that's a variation of Judaism, but it shares some similarities with Islam. In the 6th century, there are about 1.5 million Samaritans, and now, as I say, there are about 700. And they've lived alongside Israelis and Palestinians since 1948. So much goes back to that date. And listening to Hosni Cohen speaking about their way of life was incredibly troubling. The restriction of not being allowed to marry outside the Samaritan faith, the subsequent health problems and birth defects, which would be linked to frequent intermarriage. And in fact, more recently, Samaritan men have been seeking Jewish, Christian, and Muslim women outside the community in the hope that they'll convert to Samaritanism. This isn't a prospective bride, but this is Felicity Cohen, who is our leader from the PDF. And in speaking to us, Hosni was very open in being prepared to admit that women, potential brides, might be scared off by the sex customs. And I think here, this is where it becomes much more shocking in the 21st century, particularly regarding the complete isolation of women during menstruation and following childbirth. Because women who have their monthly period are forced into complete isolation for 7 days. They're barred from touching anything in the house during that time. They have to go and live with their extended family while somebody comes to look after their husband. And after a girl is born, mother and child are prevented from contact with others for 80 days, while isolation lasts for half that time, 40 days after the birth of a boy. There's more. Now, I didn't witness the scenes in these two inset photos firsthand, but I did visit the site behind these gates, which is reminiscent really of a slaughterhouse. And I found a report in a Jewish newspaper when I came home. And we see here in the next slide, the Samaritans during their annual Passover sacrifice, which dates back 3,600 years. And so once a year at sunset on Mount Gerizim, where they believe God instructed Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, an ancient ceremony attracts about 1,000 spectators from around the world. The press have got hold of this. And the elders here chant passages in ancient Hebrew and Aramaic, and then the priest reads passages from the Bible that describes the proceedings. And when the climax arrives, the community's butchers simultaneously slit the throats of a herd of sheep before dabbing the spilt blood on their foreheads to stave off the angel of death. And the international audience, as you can imagine, just watch with horrified expressions as the animals are skewered and placed in sunken fire pits. And the cooked meat is served with unleavened bread and bitter herbs at midnight. Now, Mount Gerizim itself, away from the Samaritans, is a beautiful place. The Byzantine church overlooks the city of Nablus deep in the valley below. It's an interesting archaeological site. And this was to be our next visit here down in the valley. But suddenly we were standing there and we heard gunshots. And Hisham said it wouldn't be wise to go down into the city. Nablus, like Hebron, can be very volatile, and unfortunately, again, there are clashes between the Jewish settlers and Palestinians here. So this is Nablus, a huge sprawling city in the West Bank, and you may notice a difference in the density of the buildings on the right-hand side of the photo. This is Balata camp. Originally intended to serve approximately 5,000 Palestinian refugees, today it's the largest camp in the West Bank and it's home to 30,000 people. So overcrowding, poor infrastructure, lack of privacy and living space, high unemployment, poverty, hunger are all common. The list goes on. And life in the camp can be intensified by these weekly search and arrest operations, which are conducted by security forces. And these often occur at night, resulting in damage to homes and a sense, of course, of fear and anxiety. Well, I was about to leave the hillside near Mount Gerizim, and this donkey walked into the picture. And in a way, this reminded me of the donkey which was going into Jerusalem, where we were headed for. In fact, we were about to leave for this wonderful oasis of calm and lush vegetation, the American Colony Hotel. An absolutely beautiful hotel with wonderful grounds here. It's got its own bookshop. It's quite a one-off place with, you can have tea in the gardens. It really is very, very beautiful. But sadly, our time here was cut short because en route to our final hotel, the roads throughout the city were completely gridlocked. We sat in the coach on a dual carriageway. I think there were about 3 lanes each side approaching Jerusalem for maybe a couple of hours, I'm not quite sure. All the roads throughout the city were absolutely gridlocked, and this was our introduction to the Haredi Orthodox Jews, which I mentioned earlier. Now, the previous month, and I should say that this is a press photograph. The previous month, Israel's Supreme Court had opposed the current government ruling exempting ultra-Orthodox Jews from compulsory military service. The rest of the population have to do this. However, this was an absolute red line for the Haredi, and it resulted in a major demonstration like this outside the Knesset. The Haredi see themselves as the nation's spiritual guardians. They're the fastest growing Jewish group, and as their numbers expand, so does their political power. Well, we eventually arrived into the city, and the sounds that you hear in the old city and the singing were a welcome diversion from the politics of this tragically divided country. I chatted to these two Palestinian women over coffee in a souk in the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem, and they were delighted to just chat about everyday things and to show us the tattoos on their hands. It was really nice to have another opportunity just to talk to local people. And here we come to the Dung Gate, complete with Israeli soldiers on the left as we enter what is the holiest site in the old city. To get into the old city, you have to queue from 7:30 in the morning. There's a very long queue of a number of travel groups stretching up to the security again. And if you're not through by 9:30, you have to go away. They'll only let people in during these 2 hours. Once you're in, you can stay all day, but those are the rules. And so you come to the Western Wall, built by Herod, and the most sacred site for the Jewish people. It's not only a place of prayer, but clearly a symbol of Jewish national unity. And you can only access the Temple Mount now via the checkpoint I've mentioned, metal detector, etc. And then you enter through this fairly newly constructed walkway. But as you walk towards the Muslim holy sites, you have absolutely excellent viewpoints through the wooden trellis to the Wailing Wall. And nobody else seemed to do this, but I just managed to point my camera lens through and down to the Wailing Wall, and could see the Haredi here in their prayer shawls. They're often rocking backwards and forwards as they recite verses from the Torah, the first part of the Jewish Bible. Some are wearing phylacteries, these little cube-shaped squares on their foreheads. They're made of black leather, and they contain Torah texts written on parchment, and they're worn especially by male Jews of 13 years upwards as reminders of God and of their covenant to keep the law during their daily lives. And so we reach the sites which are at the hub of the Jewish-Palestinian divide, and we're standing now on Temple Mount itself, or Al-Harim al-Sharif, which for thousands of years has been venerated as a holy site in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's the most contested piece of territory in the Holy Land since Israel occupied East Jerusalem, including the Old City in 1967. So this is Al-Aqsa Mosque, but which is no longer a place where non-Muslims may enter. Christians and Jews may only visit Temple Mount as tourists, and tensions again have been simmering near the mosque for several years, mainly because the Israeli settlers have tried to pray within the compound. So tragically, this has become the place where the suffering and oppression that Palestinians are facing periodically erupts into violent uprisings. But walking onto Temple Mount early in the morning, catching a first glimpse in the emerging morning light was really one of the highlights for me of visiting Palestine. The Dome of the Rock has been described as the crown jewel of Jerusalem's architectural heritage. It was built around 91 AD under the patronage by the Caliph Abdul al-Malik. And he wanted to make a statement to Jews and Christians that Islam was righteous and all-powerful. It could therefore build a structure much more magnificent, more splendid than a Christian church. But looking back on my trip, this was no ordinary tour, really. I came away from Palestine with so many impressions. I had to sit alone in a taxi 3 miles outside Tel Aviv airport. I had decided to fly back half a day earlier than the rest of the group. I think I regret doing that in retrospect, because I did miss something, but I had to come back for an important rehearsal for the choir that I sing with. So I was sitting alone in a taxi outside Tel Aviv airport, hoping that my passport that they'd taken away at the checkpoint would be returned to me. And all sorts of things go through your mind, questions about the settlements, the challenges which face the Palestinian people, the Bedouins, and conversely, the Haredi Jews. Sadly, there's so much animosity and suspicion against, I think, a very faint and maybe fading hope that peace might one day prevail. But what left an equally strong impression was this wonderful country itself, the beauty of the landscape of Palestine, the deserts, the oases, so rich in history and situated at the very crossroads of diverse cultures and faiths. So to the final slide. In some ways, I think this is where the wall is, here on Temple Mount itself. A mirror of the separation barrier, and it's actually twice the height of the Berlin Wall, which I visited a couple of years ago. So what's the future for Palestine? The voices who speak for the Palestinians throughout the world grow louder, but it's hard to feel confident, is it, that change will happen soon. Perhaps an increasingly distant hope that one day, as in Berlin, the wall might be dismantled, but remember it's 450 miles long. In the meantime, I feel really privileged to have visited, to have travelled to Palestine, and I think, like all of us, hope that some way might be found through this deeply entrenched conflict, which has brought pain, bloodshed, and heartache to so many people. Tricia asked me to mention, she told me that you have a sort of policy sometimes after a talk whereby the speaker suggests if you would like to donate to any sort of charity, and of course there's no pressure to do this, she asked me to suggest something. And 2018, as I say, was the year I travelled to Palestine, but it was also the year of a walk, which is the subject of this book here, Walking to Jerusalem. And it's about a pilgrimage from London to Jerusalem in solidarity and hope with the Palestinian people. I didn't know about this. I was in Guildford a few months ago, and I picked up a copy of this in Waterstones. And as a result of reading it, I learnt about the Amos Trust and the partnerships they built with the Palestinian people. They fund projects, they rebuild homes, as well as offering opportunities for people to travel and to meet the local communities there, not just in the West Bank, but from around the world. And it says at the bottom here, we believe that another world is possible, a world where justice flows, the silenced are heard, and no one is forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jan. That was so informative, so emotional. Thank you for sharing it. It must be quite very moving for you to kind of relive the experience. Thank you for such a sensitive and excellent talk. You should do a documentary, Jan. You should be on a television program. Because, like you say, you know, we don't see these photos, do we, on normal sort of TV or news or anything? So anyway, we've only got just a few seconds. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. If you want to ask Jan anything, do email me. I'll send comments on to her.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan, very much indeed. Thank you.